Hello and welcome everyone to today's SciComm Academy Lecture. While the last people are joining in, I'll give you a quick introduction to our SciComm Academy, especially for those people who don't know us yet and who are here today for the first time. At the Academy, which is part of Scimingo, a non-profit organization, we offer workshops, affordable workshops to researchers who want to learn how to reach out to a broad audience. We have courses in podcasting, video and pitching, popular science writing, etc. But we also have these lunch talks every month in which a science communication professional shares tips and tricks or their views on science communication. If you're interested in previous lectures, you can rewatch quite some of them on YouTube, or you can read about them on our website. And if you're interested in future ones, you can register for the newsletter, and the subscribe link is in the chat. Now, today we have Jane Gregory, and speaking of professionals, she's been teaching science communication over 30 years now at universities in the UK. Right now, she's affiliated to the Institute for Continuing Education at the University of Cambridge. And when we had a chat a while ago about today's talk, I remember being perhaps a bit confused and also very inspired by the chat we had. It started out with a really practical conversation about the topic of today and about our experiences. And then we had this philosophical take, and we discussed how the elite sets the agenda, how money is involved in science communication, what our responsibilities are, and what we might want to change. Now, I hope you get as inspired or perhaps just a little confused as I was, but I'm sure Jane will raise some interesting questions. Now, if you have any questions or comments during the talk, please do share them in the Q&A section. You can just type them there, and at the end of the session, we will discuss them. I will monitor them. I can ask them for you, or if you want, I can give you the floor at the end of today's lecture. The lecture is also recorded, so if you miss out on a little part, or if you want to share it with someone, you will be able to rewatch it. All right, Jane, it's about listening, you say, science communication, so we're going to listen to you. It's all yours.
Thanks very much, Helene. Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming. I hope I get the balance right between the confusion and the inspiration. So this is where I work in University of Cambridge. Very traditional, nice old building, quite typical perhaps of the some of the longer standing institutes in the UK where we teach people to communicate science. So I've been in this business, as Helene says, for quite a long time, and these are some of my books. I wanted to refer you to the chap on the right. Now, if you'd been living in the UK in the 1950s or the 1960s, you would have known exactly who this person is. Fred Hoyle was an astronomer, and he was the most famous scientist of his time. He was a very familiar voice on the radio. He did a certain amount of TV, and he was a very prolific writer. He wrote all kinds of things, textbooks, even science fiction. And if you look at the two middle pictures, he was also much represented in the mass media. In fact, the top middle picture is a mosaic of Hoyle, which is in the foyer of the National Gallery in London. So he's a very well-known person, and he was active for about 60 years, in fact. And I spent some time researching his career. And clearly he spent a lot of time communicating science, but I only ever found one occasion where he said why he did it. And what he said was that for a scientist not engaged in urgent practical problems, communicating science to the public is what earns one's keep. Now, one's keep is an old-fashioned term in English for one's living, what keeps one alive. So by communicating science, he was earning his support from the society that allowed him to deal with these non-urgent, impractical sort of problems in astronomy. Quite a bit of effort in science communication studies has gone into thinking about why communicating science is a good thing. And the answers to that question are often grouped into three, and these three are practical reasons, cultural reasons, and democratic reasons. And what we might mean by that, for example, practical reasons would be telling people about science so that they can find solutions to everyday problems. So in things like health or energy or hygiene, you can help yourself by knowing a little bit of science. And an example of practical use of science communication might be to explain to people how if you wash your hands with soap, it destroys the COVID virus. The next section is the cultural reasons. And cultural reasons for communicating science is that science is an amazing human achievement. And if we can share understandings and ideas about who we are and what we are, then we'd have done something important for human culture. And an example of this might be that to share with people the story of how recognizing the existence of a microscopic world gave us new ways of tackling contagious diseases. The last of the three is democratic reasons, and the rationale for the democratic motivation for communicating science is that a lot of the decisions we make about the direction of our society involve science or technology. So the idea is that we'll make better political choices if we know a little bit of science. And an example of this might be that COVID-19 vaccines will control the pandemic most effectively when a high percentage of people get vaccinated. Now, of course, we could have a long discussion about each of those categories, but that's often how the reasons for communicating science are summed up. It's quite a useful distinction, I think. The next thing science communication has been asking is, what should we tell people about science? And again, we have a categorization into three. And the first one is information and facts. This is kind of the obvious one, really. I mean, science spends a lot of time gathering information and trying to establish facts. So COVID-19 is a virus and is not affected by antibiotics. The next entry on this list of three is how science works. And that's about how scientists come to decisions about things, how they decide what's a fact and what isn't. And also a sense of what the limits of those scientific workings are. So it might tell people something about how science works, to know that about 10% of people will have a mild reaction to the vaccination, but we can't really predict which particular people will be affected. The third entry on the list is how science really works. And the rationale behind this is that it's probably not a good idea to pretend all the time that science is very clean and progresses neatly from idea to a test to fact. And I think an example for this is to explain how actually the COVID-19 vaccine didn't just pop out of nowhere. It wasn't a stroke of genius by somebody, that actually scientists had been working with that technology for perhaps 40 years and wondering what to do with it. And suddenly a use came along, and it was great that the scientists had been pottering around and thinking about that kind of thing for a while. So we've been having all this discussion about what we're doing and why, and what people need to know and why we should tell them. And in my career, that's gone on for 30 years. And I started to realize that actually every new intake of students, every new survey that's done, every new measure of the public's relationship with science didn't seem to be changing much. And we have to ask the question now, I think, why are people reluctant, suspicious, disengaged with science. Now we know that activity in science communication continues to grow, and since the pandemic, it's become a phrase with suddenly a very vigorous life, certainly in the English-speaking world. So despite all of this intense science communication activity, we're still finding little change in the character of the public's relationship with science. So this really bothers me, actually. I'm thinking, what have we been doing all this time? We're also faced with this concept of people who are hard to reach. And a lot of what we do in science communication is driven by this idea that there are people out there who we're just not getting to. And we need to get to these people. And they're labeled hard to reach as if it's their fault, as if it's something intrinsic to them that makes them somehow unable to enjoy and value what it is we do. And often these hard to reach people, and whichever sphere of life you look into, you find it's people like migrants or people working in their second language, older people, and so on. But one thing the COVID pandemic has taught us is that science actually serves the public unequally. And we've seen many examples of how COVID-19 has had a much worse effect on certain social groups than others. And here's a report from the Mayo Clinic in the USA, where they conclude that racial and ethnic minorities in the USA have experienced 2 to 3 times greater impact than white and non-Hispanic people. So they're 2 to 3 times more likely to have got COVID, to have been hospitalized by COVID, or to have died of COVID than the majority ethnic groups in the USA. And while there's a certain amount of explanation for that coming from the fact that certain other medical conditions are linked to ethnicity, the researchers concluded that actually there was a great deal of racism involved that marginalizes people from the health services, that people from ethnic minorities in the States tend to have the kind of work that puts them more at risk. They may live in the kind of places where diseases are more prevalent, and they may also lack access to healthcare. Notice that whether or not these people knew about science is not a factor in their experience of COVID-19. And this experience of differential outcomes for people from COVID-19 has been repeated all over in many different studies. And what the key learning point is from all this is that some social groups do not use the services provided because they feel alienated from the public authorities. And this is expressed as a lack of trust. So this very widespread conclusion came as a shock to certainly a lot of the politicians in the UK, who felt that actually let's just keep giving people information and everything will even out. So looking at that learning point, then some social groups feel alienated from public authorities. Is that a science communication problem? Is there anything we can do about it? I think we need to look at it a bit more closely, because we could understand it as meaning that there is an alienation from science, which is a side effect of a more general alienation from public authorities. So actually science is okay, it's just that it gets affected by people's relationship with other authorities. Or we might ask ourselves, is science one of those authorities in society that alienates certain people? And this, I think, is something that perhaps we've not thought about very much, because of course we all enjoy this lovable myth that science is neutral and objective and universal and for everyone. A lot of our motivation, I think, in science communication comes from this idea. One report that really made me pause and think about what we're doing came out just before the pandemic in the UK. And its conclusion was that UK science is an elite. So this group called EDIS, Equality, Diversity and Inclusion in Science, it's a collaboration between 4 or 5 leading funders and research institutes. And they acknowledged that women have less than 15% of the top jobs in science. Less than 2% of UK professors are minority ethnic women, who are 10% of the population. At the time of writing, there were very, very few research institutes that were recognised by the UK's standard charter mark for good practice in the employment of gay people. The report noted that 44% of UK Nobel Prize winners went to fee-paying schools. So in the UK, you can either get your education for free in a government-run school, or you can pay and go to a, well, we call them public schools, but they're kind of the opposite of public. And in the UK, 44% of Nobel Prize winners went to these schools where you pay, which actually only educate 7% of the UK population. The report also noted that 15% of scientists are from the working class, which is 35% of households. And this really took me by surprise, because all through the 1950s and 1960s in the UK, science was advocated as a way for a working class child to improve their status in life. One final conclusion of this report was that science communication underserves and misrepresents low-income and minority ethnic groups in the UK. And there, the report cites the work of Emily Dawson that we'll hear about in a minute. So I must say this came as something of a shock to me. And I thought, wow, this is the outfit I've been encouraging people to tell others about for a long time. Last week as well, I noticed this recent paper, which is about science conferences. A big team of people around the globe evaluated the provision at science conferences. And they found that there's a big lag compared to standards in the rest of life on issues such as providing support for mothers with babies, supporting younger people, even whether or not the venues for conferences were accessible to people with mobility problems. And perhaps not the least worst, but certainly the most surprising, science conferences have very, very big carbon footprints compared to what might be achieved. So it looked to me as though science is perhaps needs to scrutinize itself a little bit and see how it can improve its act. I think one thing also that we need to bear in mind when we think about, particularly in the way we think about how it affects minority populations, is that if you look at questions about why and how discrimination persists in our society, you can often find science being a strong voice in those stories. And I don't know how we go about addressing that, but you don't have to go very far to read about how women are quite unsuitable for public life. It wasn't so long ago in the UK that gay men were given electric shock treatments to cure their problem. And we certainly have recent examples of minority populations being used basically for medical experiments. So science has, in that regard, not been neutral and has contributed to and supported ideas and practices that we now think of as discriminatory, and all this within living memory. So I think there's ways in which science can perhaps look at itself and catch up with the way in which ideas in society more broadly are developing. Now, I mentioned Emily Dawson earlier, and in her work on exclusion from science communication, she makes the rather strong statement that science communication is a form of cultural imperialism. And what does she mean by that? So she says it's when the culture, views, and practices of the culturally dominant appear universal at the expense of the marginalized. Now, I've just given you a description of science from the EDIS report that it's done by white, male, wealthy, straight people. Okay. So we have in science communication then a culturally dominant group that is perhaps thinking that what they're doing is for everyone, but in fact, it's leaving people out. And this isn't just about, according to Dawson, this isn't just about people being left out. I mean, there's all kinds of public communication that I am very happy to be left out, frankly. But Dawson says that people who are unable to participate or benefit or otherwise shape public practices are experiencing not only marginalization, but also oppression. And I don't think I'd ever thought of science communication as oppressive before. So, what's going on here? Well, let's have another look at these, at the unequal service that's offered. And if we look at these conditions that identify people who don't get the full benefits of what science and technology have brought to society, we can see that the conditions there, racism, type of work, location, access to healthcare, they have a strong element in them that suggests that these people don't have money. So there's a group of people who are also poor, who are being poorly served by science and technology. So these people are economically disadvantaged as well as disadvantaged in their experience of healthcare. If we look again at the EDIS report, we see this strong element of money. There's a division happening here between the better off and the less well off in society. And what picture this paints is of science by the wealthy and for the wealthy. Dawson asked her excluded publics who they think science is for, and they all said, oh, it's for people with good jobs, who've got a nice house. Basically what they were describing was the middle class. Now this research is happening in the UK, and I know we have slightly weird ideas about class in the UK. I had a look how a middle class person is defined in the UK, and it's in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen there. When you were 14, what was the job of the main earner in your household? Now, in my case, the answer to that was engineer. So I'm definitely middle class. I checked to see what's a middle class person in Belgium, and apparently it's somebody who earns between 18,000 and 37,000 euros a year. I was interested, though, to look at what happens if you Google the middle class. And these pictures are from around the world. but I was interested to see how, obviously we see people with smiles on their faces, nice clothes, they've got cars, they've got houses big enough to have a nice garden. But we also see a nuclear family. There's something heteronormative about those images. And I didn't choose them that carefully, give it a go, So these are the people for whom excluded people think science is for. Now, about 10 years ago, I started having these thoughts that maybe there was something going on in science communication that was, maybe economic or to do with money. Because none of these other reasons, like democracy and practical use and culture, seem to be making the slightest bit of an impact on society. And I thought, well, maybe, although we think we're trying to make a difference in those ways, actually the difference we're making is not in those ways at all. And maybe the difference we're making is to the economy. And I wrote three papers that touched on this. And this one, with my colleague Charles Thorpe, who's now in San Diego, we called it Producing the Post-Fordist Public. So it's about what kind of economy we have that's after the age of mass production. So it's an economy of knowledge work and digital products and so on. And what we argued in this paper was that an important driver for science communication is the need to transfer innovations into the market. We had seen that science communication resources are concentrated on near market technologies. If you look at the history of what the EU has funded in science communication research, you can see this. And it's certainly the case in UK, where funding for science communication, at the beginning of my career, it was in the Ministry for Culture, then it moved to education, and then it moved to business, where it still resides. This kind of policy is supported by the idea that the more people know about science, the more likely they will support marketization of innovations. That is, they will constitute a society in which innovations, new technologies are welcomed and not rejected, and think genetically modified foods here. And most importantly, a welcoming public will give investors confidence. And when you have a near market technology, the thing you need most of all is an investor. Now, I have to say this paper got a lot of attention in that a lot of people read it, but hardly anybody cited it. And I heard from people saying, wow, really interesting paper. Don't believe it at all. So, that was good in a way. We certainly enjoyed provoking people at the time. Now, Charles comes from a background of political sciences, and he was able to show me the work of this guy, Maurizio Lazzarato, who's a sociologist and philosopher. And in his terms, we can identify science communication as information work. And Lazzarato points to a kind of productive labor in our era that he calls immaterial labor. We're not making things like the old era of mass production. Well, of course, we are, because we still need things. But there's this whole extra economic activity about producing things that kind of aren't real, like messages or information. And Lazzarato defines immaterial labor as what produces the informational and cultural contents of the commodity. So we have a thing, and then we need to talk about it and set information in motion in order for the thing to have some kind of whole life and use in society. And it's not just the science communicators who are doing that work. According to Lazzarato, the public are also working, because the public are productive, right? They're doing work to produce goods in the economy. by means of the reception that gives the product a place in life. So by engaging with stories about new technologies in the public sphere, the public are undertaking the work of bringing innovations into the real world and finding a way to feel comfortable with them. So there's this innovation work going on in science, which the science communicators are then adding value to by talking about it. And the public are confirming, or indeed sometimes rejecting, that value by settling the innovations in to public life. Now, just recently, that paper that I wrote with Charles has been getting a lot of attention again. And I thought, what's going on? Then I found out. There's a guy in Seville called Luis Arboledas Lerida, who's written 4 or 5 papers now, exploring the relationship between science communication and capitalism. And what Luis says, he goes a step further, and he starts his papers by saying, oh, well, there's these people like Jane Gregory and Charles Thorpe, and they've said, you know, they've gone a certain distance, but I want to go further. He says that science communication is inherently capitalistic. Now, he's a Marxist. I have to read his theory several times to get it, but I think I've got it. He starts from a point I would have to agree with, which is that science communication is commonly represented as bridging a gap between science and society. And he says this gap is necessary because if science is everywhere in society, if it were common sense, we'd have no need to pay for it. If science was something everybody could do and everybody's got, it's of no value. He also makes a very interesting point that science needs funding. And when money comes from the government, it's called funding. And when it comes from corporations, it's called investment. But science needs this money long before we know what it's going to produce. Quite right. We call it blue skies funding in science. We often find that outcomes of scientific research are unexpected. So who's going to put money into something when they don't know what's going to come out of the other end? That's not a good business model. So as the world moved from this era of production where somebody said, I need a table, and someone then makes a table, and the need for the table puts a price on the table and the price is paid, we can't do that with science. We have to imagine the possible value of the products of science. And science communication, through what Lazzarato would call immaterial labor or information work, helps us to do that. So at the end of this paper, Arboledas Lerida has concluded that science communication is intrinsic to the capitalist production around science in our era. Now, I was interested to see his interpretation of this gap. I mean, I think we've all heard of this gap. We talk about it, you know, we talk about bridging the gap between science and society. We talk about bringing science and the public closer together. There's this gap. And certainly in science studies, we imagine this gap as something that has a kind of dual purpose. It's something to reach out across, but it's also something that defines scientists as special. And it's from this special status that scientists draw their authority. So certainly this gap is a problematic thing, and it has, there are reasons to reduce it and there are reasons to maintain it. And that tension between those two aims is something that science communicators have to negotiate all the time. So if science communication is an important element of capitalism in our society as it presently stands, which is based around innovation and the marketization, the fast marketization of innovations, then where's all the money? Why aren't science communicators rich? Well, science communication staff have massively increased in number over the last, well, certainly over my career. In my university, there are 136 people working in science communication roles. I mean, when I started out, there were none. A lot of them, though, you meet them one week, they're gone the next. They're badly paid, they're on short contracts, they have no prospect of developing a career, no job security. They are, of course, mostly women. If science communicators are adding value to mere ideas about innovation, we can't privilege them or highlight them in any way. We can't draw attention to that. It can't be the people who are inventing this fictional, for now anyway, value of science communication, of science products, because that would give the game away. These people have to be dispensable. We have to be able to shoot the messenger. So the money's not going into science communication, and so who is getting it? Well, I think we are suffering from the same problem that's afflicting the economy of the globe, which is that the money is all going to a very, very small number of people. And if you look at the kind of industries that our work supports, and you then look at who are the rich people in society, we find that this era of information work is concentrating money on a very small number of people. And what this graphic shows is that since 1995, the top 1% of the global population has now 20 times more of the global wealth than the bottom half of the population. So the top 1% has as much money as the bottom 50%. And that seems to obtain around the world. It's particularly bad in the USA. So I would put it to you that we are supporting an economic system at this particular point in history in which we are assisting the flow of money away from everyone and towards a very small number of people who have had, admittedly, very clever ideas about how to develop and marketize new technologies. So all of this quite depressing for me, because here I am thinking about science as an unwelcoming elite establishment. I'm thinking about the capitalist system. And for me, the motivation always was that science communication offers science for everyone. I always thought of it as a left-wing project. And yet I'm now starting to worry that we're trapped into some kind of capitalist machine that's sending money to the wrong places at, vast expense. I mean, Britain is a very wealthy country, and a great many of my fellow citizens rely on charities for their food these days. and nobody seems to be all that bothered about it. And that's in a wealthy country. So what can we do? What can we do about it? Emily Dawson, always very positive. She has the idea that actually all we need to do, it's easy. We can find ways of being inclusive and empowering and bring more voices to the table. We don't just have to listen to the white middle-class men of science communication. We can listen to multiple voices and open up new spaces and engage with publics in equitable ways. Right, there are some practical tips coming because Emily Dawson's colleague Louise Archer refers in her work to a different kind of capital. So money is not the only way to be wealthy. And Louise Archer proposes this concept that she calls science capital. And to be rich in science capital, you would have to be confident in knowing and understanding something about science. You would have to have the idea that science is something that relates to you and your everyday life. You would be comfortable talking about science in everyday situations. You can see how science can be used to solve problems. You would be engaged with science media. You would be joining in science-related events or clubs. So you might be in the bird watching group, or you might go to the science festival. People with high science capital tend to have family members who are also interested or engaged with science. And another way to have science capital is to know people who know about science. And actually, it's a very interesting element in studies of social mobility that knowing somebody in the group that you aspire to join is a really, really important factor. Now, Louise Archer works with school children, and measuring science capital in UK high schools, she finds that 68%, 2/3, quite a lot of kids in the UK, when they're aged about 15, 16, they have medium levels of science capital. That's fine. There's still 27% of people who have low science capital. And this, I should say, is after, compulsory science education, which we have in the UK up to age 16. And the people with high science capital is actually a very small group, 5%. And it's those 5% who are likely to choose to continue to study and work in science. Looking at the people with low science capital reminds me of this category of hard to reach. And how we respond to the hard to reach relates to Archer's practical tips, which I'll come back to in a minute. And thinking about when we label someone hard to reach, it kind of identifies the problem as being their fault, doesn't it? So are these people hard to reach because they're sticking their fingers in their ears and saying, no, 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 not this science, go away? Or, on the other hand, is it because the people are listening to us and wondering what on earth it is to do with them? What's that person saying? Why are they telling me that? Archer's solution is that we need to get more onto the right-hand side of this screen and reorientate what we do when we communicate science. She comes up with these 3 ways of doing it. And she says to follow these 3 guidelines, you don't actually have to change a great deal. It's more to do with orientation and the way you build the relationship with your public. So let's go through these. The first one, absolutely the first thing, is that what you're doing is about the people you're talking to. It's not about you. It's not about us. It's about them. And Archer recommends personalizing and localizing. So framing your approach to the topic around things that your audience might have noticed or that you can show them, or asking them to remember something from their experience. it might be when a car broke down, or when a particularly hot day, or a test they had in hospital. Referring them to their household. Does anyone in your house have this experience? And also involving their feelings and opinions. So asking how they feel about something, or what is it they would like to see in the world. So start from where the audience is. Next pillar. Eliciting, valuing, and linking. So you've now got an idea of what the condition of your audience is. You know where it is that they stand in regard to what you want to talk about. So congratulate them on that, thank them on that, for that. Affirm that their experience is relevant. Then you connect it to your experience, right? So you start with them, you then connect it to yourself. So you might affirm what that person has seen and then add on what the scientists saw when they looked. Or you might pick up on a story from somebody who has a family member who works in something science related, and then say, and we do the same kind of thing, da, da, da. So eliciting, valuing, and linking is the second step. On the third step, we have building the science capital dimensions. So I've paraphrased them slightly and repeated them here. Having people be confident in their knowledge is a lot to do with the relationship you have with people. So it's encouraging people, thanking them, being positive about their contributions, even if it's not the one you wanted, being flexible about allowing people their own take on the world. And that, again, will make them comfortable in talking about science. So that really does require that you open up a space for your audiences to talk, because they won't gain confidence or feel comfortable if you haven't done that. And emphasizing, of course, that science is about them. Showing how science can be used. Now, it is a habit of scientists often to be a little bit reluctant to speculate about how science could impact the world, but actually thinking about how science could be used is something that ordinary people do all the time. So why would we not discuss it with them and open up that space for ideas and suggestions? Encouraging people to engage with science media. Well, I mean, it could be that you simply show how an issue has been in the news, or you may add a link to a magazine, or you could include a YouTube clip, and that would alert people to the fact that there are other ways of accessing science. And you know how it is, you go to YouTube and you find you've watched 40 odd videos. So giving people that first step into these resources can really help the way they engage subsequently. Joining in science events or clubs, well, maybe you could create an event and encourage people to join, or start a club, or provide ideas for local organizations to develop events. Very hard to create for somebody, a family member who is also interested or engaged in science, unless you kind of go and marry them or something. That's the only way I could think of, which is a bit drastic. But knowing people in science, well, if you've gone to engage with a particular public, then by the time you've left, they know someone in science. So if you can find some time in your science communication to actually build social relations with people, then what you've done is added to their science capital, because they know you now. So there are practical things we can do to enlarge the sphere of who is thinking about science. Maybe even we can enlarge the sphere of who is going to become a scientist. I wanted to leave you with this list, which I drew up, and I wish I was better at referencing because I can't quite tell you where it came from, although I know I wrote it after attending a lecture by Manuel Castells, who is the great theorist of the digital age. And he was talking about what it means to be educated now. And I thought, well, okay, what does it mean to be educated in science communication now? So we start off with the conceptual repertoire. That is, there will be theories and ideas in the area you want to know about, and it's worth having a grasp of those. Theories and ideas are useful. In our field, of course, we need some science knowledge, and we need some critical understanding of that science knowledge. We need to be able to look at it, learn it, and understand what it really means. Now, Castells, looking at the digital world, says that everyone needs communication skills now, because a lot of what we're doing is communicating. A lot of our work and our jobs are around communicating. But of course, science communicators need communication skills. And we also need some technological competence, because everything we do in our field is at a screen, and it's using digital tools. And we're expected now to work in video and audio, not just words. So technological competence alongside communication skills is very important. And if you look at those top four, that's probably what you get if you study science communication on a university course. The next one, critical consumption. Maybe some courses will help you to study this. Critical consumption means looking at science communication and understanding what's positive about it, where it succeeds, where it fails, who it's serving, what the benefits of it are, what the problems are that it might cause. And reflexivity means being able to do this to your own communication. So we need to be able to think about what we're doing in ways that help us do it better, or do it in ways that reach different publics. We're now getting into the area where you probably won't find a curriculum in a science communication course, and that is the area of political and economic literacy. And for Castells, our worlds are so interconnected that we cannot do anything anywhere without having some grasp of the politics and economics of what's going on. I think this is a really big challenge. I remember the point in my life where I thought, oh, wow, I know absolutely nothing about economics. It's particularly worrying this in the UK at the moment, because you may have noticed that our economy has gone bonkers and is being run by people who 2 weeks ago were doing totally other jobs. But anyway, so political and economic literacy are really, really important. And, you know, I don't think there's many people who are trained in science who had a chance to do undergraduate study in politics and economics. That tends to be happening over the other side of the campus. The next point on Castells' list is moral inquisitiveness. We're all very much, certainly those of us in this privileged elite, we're very much empowered to observe, to express our views, to move information around, and this can have consequences. So the idea of moral inquisitiveness is that we keep asking ourselves, what good is this doing? What harm is this doing? Who is experiencing that benefit and that harm? And is that right? And we may have to step through a number of sequences in order to find out where this benefit or harm is happening. But we should keep asking, because when everything is connected to everything else, it may be that what we're doing in one place seems good, but when it travels to another place, it's not doing such a good job at all. And last on the list is cultural sensitivity. And cultural sensitivity refers to this idea that actually people are quite diverse, they're quite varied, they have different ideas about how the world should be, whether that's in politics or culture or religion, or just how to go about daily life. And Castells would argue that in this very connected world, we are going to encounter people who are different from us, and we need to be aware and not take for granted that their take on life is going to be different from ours, and challenge ourselves then to engage with those people in a constructive way, especially at times when we think science has the solution and we can see that not everybody is benefiting from it. So I'm going to leave you there. I hope that's been, even if slightly confusing, then a little bit inspiring as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane. Definitely, it was very inspiring. So thank you for your candid and thoughtful presentation. I have a couple of questions myself, but I would like to invite everyone who is here to share their questions or thoughts or comments in the Q&A, because we have some time to go over them. One of the things I was thinking, Jane, in the first half of your presentation is when we're talking about science and science communication not being inclusive, if I can put it like that, you gave some tips on how to change that in science communication. But is that possible? Don't we need science itself, research, to become different and take into account this cultural sensitivity before we can communicate in that manner? If my question is clear.
I do think that, yes, absolutely. And I know that in recent years, there's been a lot of journalism about how that could be achieved, and a lot of horror stories. You know, you hear much more now about cases of discrimination in science workplaces. You hear about cases of misbehavior, and institutions are much more now publishing their data, which often doesn't look very good. You know, if science labs were a business, you know, they would have been regulated or you know, punished or whatever often, because they are very far behind. And I think there's a kind of exceptionalism around science, that we're kind of unquestionably good, and that, you know, we're doing everything for the benefit of humankind. And actually sometimes, you know, it's just worth reflecting. I mean, other organizations have been through this, you know. I mean, there was a period in the UK where buildings were required by law to have a wheelchair accessible entrance. So suddenly there was lots of work for stonemasons and bricklayers to make these entrances, which are now routine and commonplace. But I just heard from a colleague who's a wheelchair user that actually science labs were not required to have that because of often they have a particular, you know, architectural design, they have particular needs. And so it didn't happen. Well, you know, we shouldn't be waiting to be forced by law to make our buildings accessible to colleagues in wheelchairs, I think. So yes, certainly science does need to do that, you know, and those of us who work in science journalism can say that if that's what we believe. And there are campaigners looking to do that, and there are funding agencies who are starting to say, well, I'm sorry, but unless you get more women into senior positions, we're not going to fund you anymore. I mean, this is happening. But I think when we look to the future, we have to think, how do we break this this progression of science looking a certain way, certain sectors of the population seeing themselves reflected in science, and only those certain sectors then going into science? how do we get people to take those first steps to say, okay, maybe I'm going to be the only gay person in the lab, but I'm going to go for it. You know, how do we encourage people to do that? And I think this idea of building science capital, giving people a sense that they have this wealth in their relationship with science that they can put to work in their lives, is really important. And, you know, that seems like too slow. It seems too slow a way to wait for our teenagers, you know, to get the top jobs in the science institutions. But, you know, sometimes these things take time. I think it's a process that's underway. And as science communicators, by recognizing this process is underway, we can encourage and support it.
Definitely. I'm also thinking, if we want to reach those people who, like you say, can't be reached, but that's kind of a wrong way of saying it, or a close-sighted way, don't we need collaboration or co-creation? Isn't perhaps civil science, aren't civil science projects, for example, a more concrete way to reach out instead of trying to connect to someone's ideas and someone's life without involving them in science?
Yeah, well, I mean, once you start valuing people's individual experience, then they will realize that they are closer to science than they might have thought they were. And that's because you have gone to them, right? You're not standing somewhere and saying, hey, you lot, come over here, you know. But I absolutely agree. If you can make a partnership with an organization, then that's, you know, you've done pillar number 2, you've done the linking part. But often it takes quite a lot for a community that feels marginalized to even get to the position where they have the confidence to, or even the inclination to collaborate with you. And sometimes it can be just one inspirational individual who does that. I met an amazing woman a few months ago. She came to talk to my students, and she works in the northeast of England, and she develops relationships between minority communities and the ambulance service. So it's helping people who might be reluctant to call an ambulance in a medical emergency, you know, right, which can kill you if you don't do that. It's helping people to understand that actually the ambulance service is for them. And this lady is of West African origin. The northeast of England is a very multicultural area. It's also quite economically deprived. And I asked this lady how she got into that role. She said, oh, well, I had a fantastic job in finance, but it wasn't very rewarding. So, you know, she had that platform of success and confidence and no doubt a bit of money in the bank. And she was able to say, okay, now I can do a different kind of work in my community. So kind of in a way I was disappointed because I wanted her story to be different. But I think it's, you know, it's an example of how you do need kind of to have something behind you, to have the confidence to take your community into a new place in society, and that's what needs to be done. So where there are those people who are willing to engage and want to, and then that's brilliant, because that takes you on to stage 2 immediately. But sometimes I think you really do have to start from the beginning, and especially with children like Archer does, whose families may never have been involved in science before.
Step by step, I guess.
Yep.
Thank you for that answer. We have a question by Mieke. I'll enable her to talk. Mieke, feel free if you want to ask your question yourself.
Okay. Hello. Hi, Jane.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thank you for the very interesting presentation. I do have a little question about the statistics, because you said that, well, very shortly summarized, I'll quote it simply, rich people are more science literate than poor people.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering whether the questionnaires being sent out for such kind of studies, are they biased? Because I can imagine that most of them are actually only filled in by science literate people. So how do you correct for this bias? And secondly, and that's just a thought that came up in me, but I have this this idea, it could be wrong, but I have this idea that among the group of super rich people, not so many people are authentically interested in science. So I suspect that in the super elite, yeah, this percentage could be lower. And has this been researched in the past, or has this at least been taken into mind in the setup of the sociological studies? Very curious.
Well, I don't know if you remember our most recent ex-Prime Minister, Mr. Boris Johnson, but he was taken to epitomize the kind of upper class person who has absolutely no knowledge whatsoever about science and no respect for it. Yeah, I would agree with you. There's certainly a social elite in this country for whom science is, you know, beneath their concern. With regard to the way the surveys are done, I can only say that I use sources that I think have done the job properly.
Yeah.
And I think they're aware, the people who do this kind of work, they're aware of the biases. Now, I think what's good about Louise Archer's work is that she works in schools, and it's a kind of a captive population. So people don't get left out. If there is a bias, as I say, I think they're aware of them. I think it's a fairly consistent result from reliable researchers that there is a correlation between, well, the way it's described in the literature is there's a correlation between social capital and science capital. And social capital is about having access to the good things in life, having education, comfortable lifestyle, decent place to live, good education, whatever. And people with high science capital tend to also have high social capital. And that tends to mean that they're slightly better off financially. Yeah. So I agree with you. It is very challenging to get these data right, but I think there's sufficient evidence that certainly for the UK, which is the only area I really know in any depth, the poorer you are financially, the less likely it is that you'll have a strong and positive relationship with science.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mieke, for asking that question. If anybody has another question, this is the time. If not, I'm going to end with a very practical one. Imagine I'm a science communicator at a research institution, and I want to spread questionnaires, do a civil science project, or just reach out. How could I perhaps try and overcome differences in internet accessibility? Do you have any tips for e-inclusion in science communication?
Well, I think that we do think first about digital means, and perhaps we could remember that it wasn't that long ago that people enjoyed going to their church or to their village hall or to the school sports day. You know, there are lots of places where populations gather. I think it really does depend on who your population is. I mean, one thing one of my students studied recently was how to bring science to people in prison. And the number one problem is that people in prison are not allowed computers. So, you know, so much of what we think about science communication is gone. You know, you have to start again. So I think, yeah, you know, digital inclusion, it's something that Castells has worked on a lot, and it is so closely tied to poverty again. And we found this in the UK during lockdown, when school children were told, oh, go home and do your lessons online. And, you know, in some parts of London, it was like 4 out of 10 families who did not have online services in their house. So I think when e-inclusion is so closely tied to wealth, and there's not a lot we can immediately do about wealth, we have to think of, you know, other ways. And I think there are other ways in a lot of communities. I mean, I've in the last 5 years moved to a very rural part of England, away from central London. And I'm just amazed that, you know, how much people talk to each other and how much paper communication there is and how much people gather in public spaces. It's, you know, there are a lot of different modes of life apart from the electronic. And, you know, this idea that the best thing to do is, you know, a laptop for every kid, well, which is one of the slogans in this country. Well, every kid does need a laptop if we're not communicating with them in any other way. And there are lots of other ways to do it. And if you think about social capital as involving interpersonal relations, I mean, perhaps I should say, I spend a lot of time these days talking about what's basically social relations, building social relations. And it's important to remember in Louise Archer's scheme that an important contributor to science capital is that you've met someone who works in science. So modes of science communication that involve meeting someone who works in science might be a better way to go than expecting everybody to engage via a computer. But I think, you know, Castell's last point, cultural sensitivity, there are some people who want to go to the village hall and have a cup of tea with a scientist. And there are other people who want to sit on their own and engage with their computer screen. So I think we have to think about multiple ways. And if you start with where your public are, if your public are gathering, you know, in the town square on a Saturday, then that's where you go, because you go where they are. That's Archer's first point. You go where they are. So we have to do lots of different things, I think, because we have to recognize that our public is made up of lots of different groups that have different needs and are in different places. And I'll tell you a sad story. I went to talk at research institute in my university, and the scientists there, they were saying, well, you know, all this theory is all very well, but what are we supposed to do? You know, so I was saying, well, maybe you could befriend one of the groups in the village where you live. Are there any groups in the village where you live? And the guy said, well, I don't know, what do you mean groups? I said, well, is there Boy Scouts or Young Mothers Group? Or he said, well, how would I know? And I think this poor guy, he was very lacking himself in social capital. He had very limited connections with his local community, you know, which sometimes happens to scientists because they work very hard, you know. But the guy had no connections himself with the community on which to build, not even basic knowledge about what was happening in his community. And yet he thought he could somehow go and talk to them about science. So, you know, my advice to him was, well, just get a bit involved, you know, join the tennis club or volunteer in the theatre or whatever it is, you know, just integrate with your world. And then you maybe have a chance to talk to them about science.
Thank you so much, Jane. I hear lots of topics to think about, but also an encouragement to go out there and to see it as part of the job, perhaps, to reach out in your own network and to create a bigger network. Now, in case anyone is interested in inclusiveness in science communication, we have a workshop on that in about a month. Now it's sold out, but you can always put yourself on the waiting list, because sometimes we have a spot that becomes available again. In addition, next month, we are discussing gamification, an entirely different way to engage in science communication, but a promising one, both off and online games with Bieke Zaman and Jana Wendler. So I kindly invite you to join in that session as well. You will get a follow-up email, including the recording of today's session, because I think there's a lot of material you might want to look back to. Jane, thank you so much for taking the time, and keep up the great work you're doing, and hopefully see you in next session as well. Bye, everyone.